Good afternoon and welcome to our first medical device webinar on interoperability. We are happy to have more than 150 participants that found time to join our webinar. My name is Moritz Pfeiffer. I'm a member of the Executive Board of Unity Switzerland and mainly responsible for the industry's medical technology and pharmaceuticals. With me are my colleagues Stefan Schlichting and Klaas Rakebrand. Stefan is manager at Unity, holds a PhD in medical informatics, and has long-term experience in medical technology. He will be the presenter of our today's session.
Hello.
Klaas is team lead for innovation at Unity, holds a PhD in biomedical engineering, and has a broad project experience amongst other things from regulatory aspects to the service design within the healthcare industry. He will consolidate all of your questions so that we can have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation.
A warm welcome also from my side.
To create as much value as possible for you, we have some information up front. If you do have any questions, feel free to use the question function at any point of time. As just mentioned, Klaas will consolidate these. Next week, we are going to provide you the slides we are presenting today, the consolidated Q&A session, and the link to the recording of the webinar. Within the upcoming weeks and months, we are going to host several webinars along the big picture, which we are also showing on our homepage. This includes market and customers, lifecycle intelligence, business strategy, regulatory efficiency, product documentation, product and service development, and traceability. Now I wish you an exciting and educational webinar and hand over to Stefan.
Thank you, Moritz, for the kind introduction. My name is Stefan Schlichting, and I'd like to welcome you also to the webinar Medical Device Interoperability, Adding Value with Standardized Interfaces. Besides being a manager for Unity, I'm also heading the IEEE 11073 SDC Standardization Working Group, and I'm a former member of the board of OR.net, a non-profit organization with the objective to foster interoperability. Today, the learning objectives are we will identify the interoperability challenges, and based on an exemplary customer need from intensive care, I will explain how the IEEE 1173 SDC Standards Family can be utilized to solve some interoperability challenges, and how it relates to other standards that are used inside of hospitals like HL7 FHIR or IHE PCD, or as it is now called IHE DEF for devices. I will shortly touch on the regulatory challenges involved with putting interoperable medical devices on the market, and in the end, I will identify benefits for hospitals, manufacturers, as well as patients. Now that you know us, we would like to get you as the audience a little bit better and have two questions for you before we start. Type 1 would be which kind of company you are or organization you are. And the second question will be regarding the involvement in standardization organizations. Thank you, Klaas. I think we can now switch to the second question. Thank you. So as I see it, we have some members here that work in interoperability already, part of SDOs, and we also have a broad audience that is not active in standardization, but probably uses standards along their work. I would like to start now with the interoperability challenges. So I would like to depict what I see as the interoperability challenges based on a typical clinical scene. But maybe before we start, I should explain about what I understand as interoperability. And for that, I took an introduction, or I looked into the introduction of the FDA interoperability guidance. And there's a statement that says, medical device interoperability is the ability to safely, securely, and effectively exchange and use information among one or more devices, products, and technologies or systems. That means that there are two parts to the definition of interoperability: the ability to exchange information and the ability to use this information that has been exchanged. So now coming back to the interoperability challenges. If you look at such a scene, you basically see that there are a lot of medical devices which generate a lot of data about the patient, the current workflow, and of course, also about the current configuration of the devices itself. But the availability of this data to other products or systems is typically limited, especially directly at the point of care. And of course, not to mention the capability for external control, which is typically even more limited or not there at all. So based on my definition of interoperability, I would like to summarize the situation as follows, using a quote from 2007 that states, interoperability is an almost non-existing feature of medical devices. But why is this a problem, and how does this relate to customer needs? As Moritz explained, this is one of the big topics in our big picture. So I would now like to address what might be customer needs and why interoperability is needed for that. On this slide, I would actually like to summarize that the lack of interoperability leads to high hurdles for product and service innovations, especially to those that are intended to make use of the data of medical devices. Some examples are data-driven clinical applications, maybe those that are real-time displays directly at the point of care, or remote supervisor systems, but also for systems for automated documentation, where the data can be later used for clinical research or just for reimbursement purposes. And of course, all kinds of care automation, from semi-automated OR setups to physiological closed loop controllers to safety interlocks. Even though you can probably implement some of these use cases in other ways, all these use cases would benefit from medical device interoperability. And I want to introduce now the example that we will use along this webinar coming from the intensive care world. So I took a recent LinkedIn post as a motivation, where a clinician showed how he moved the control user interface of a ventilator outside the patient room to limit staff exposure in the current situation. If you read the comments, the main objective is really to limit the staff exposure, and a broader solution would be not only to control the ventilator, but also, of course, the other devices like infusion pumps or patient monitors. So how would an interoperable medical device system look like that allows all these features and to be implemented? And for that, I would like to introduce an example, which I always call device A. So it's no specific product, but it might be this solution to address this specific customer need to limit staff exposure. It is a software as a medical device, which is intended to visualize the data from the medical devices inside the patient room. It would also indicate the alarm status and allows to control the settings of the devices. So all of the devices are connected to our device A, and it uses the data and is really interoperable part of that system. So let's continue with this example device and see how the device would be integrated into the hospital setup today. Today's most common integration pattern would be probably look something like this. The ventilator would be connected to the patient monitor, probably with a serial connection. It would exchange data, but there's typically no control flow on this line. The patient monitor itself is connected to a patient monitoring network, and provides the data maybe to other patient monitors or a central station, and maybe to something like a gateway or some other means where the data is provided to third-party applications like our device A. So on this is depicted here with the servers in the left corner of the picture. If we are lucky, then this kind of gateway maybe has an IHE devices output, maybe DEC or ACM interface, but most likely we would find some kind of a proprietary API. For the infusion pumps depicted here on the right side of the picture, it would be more or less the same setup. Maybe they are wireless, which is very common nowadays, but they would also have some kind of a gateway where you could access the data. So if we would like to integrate our exemplary device A, then we would need to implement two APIs to get the data out of the devices and to display it. And it would normally be the case that we probably don't have any possibility to control these devices from outside the room, because these features are typically not exposed through the gateways. So, and if we would like to display the data, we would also need to check if the API at the gateway is actually intended to provide data for clinical purposes. So for example, like for our medical device A, that fulfills, of course, a clinical purpose and need. So I have a question for you here. Do you think this is a suitable situation? And I would like to get your opinion on that. Okay, thank you very much. I see most of you think that this is maybe not the most suitable thing to use, but it is of course a feasible solution and it might be possible to implement it. In the next minutes, I would like to discuss with you how could this problem be solved, this customer need be addressed with an interoperable medical device system. So what I would like to discuss with you now is how do we achieve medical device interoperability and what are the key topics that needs to be addressed. So before we look at how we can integrate our devices in such a system, I would like to address the key topics. First and foremost, of course, our device A that we looked at would of course benefit from a protocol with a standardized syntax and semantic so that our device can easily make use of the data and maybe implement a safe control user interface. Moreover, if you don't want to set it up all manually, we would need some kind of a plug and play capability, but of course you have to say plug and play in quotes. It basically means that we need some mechanism to discover the devices inside of our setup and to get to know which capabilities they have. Different ventilators may have different capabilities, same as for patient monitors or infusion pumps. And of course, the system should be designed in a way that if we add a new device, let's say a dialysis machine maybe, we maybe also want to display that data and even maybe have the possibility to control some of the settings. From a technical communication, from a technical standpoint, we also need different communication patterns, of course. There are things like alarms, which only occur episodically, but of course there's the general data reporting of the data stream so that we can have live waveform, for example, and there's as well external control. And of course, all related to low latency if you want to. As we develop a medical device, we also have to address the topic, of course, of risk management. That is for sure. This may include something like how do we allow safe remote control? what do we need to consider? What might be preconditions for our device A so that it's actually allowed to control a ventilator? And of course, there's always the topic of data privacy and all the other aspects of cybersecurity. If we later want to analyze the data, or if we want to have a synchronized display maybe of ventilation data with patient monitoring data, time synchronization is of course also needed to a common time base. So now that we have more or less like the key ingredients of such interoperability protocol, I would like to know if you or your organization already utilizes an interoperable standard, or if you provide products having an interoperability standard. Thank you. So I see that there is already a lot of use of interoperability standard, basically from the enterprise world, HS7, IHE. And what I would like to discuss with you now, or to show you now, is how I see the interoperability standards landscape from the perspective of a medical device. So on the left side in the green circle, we have, from my perspective, a point of care medical device interoperability standards family, which is IEEE 11073 SDC. And this standards family addresses basically the key topics or aspects that I just mentioned before: time synchronization, plug and play, risk management, as well as cybersecurity. The green ecosystem, from my perspective, focuses on the customer needs and use cases that are primarily related to using live data directly at the patient bedside for maybe the immediate management of the patient and decision making. That's why I also would integrate our device A using standards protocol from the green side of this picture. On the right-hand side, we have already the very established hospital IT ecosystem. And as you just pointed out in your vote, a lot of you or your institutions provide products or use products that use established standards like HS7 version 2, maybe nowadays also HS7 Fire. Here, from my perspective, the focus is more on analyzing the long-time series of data, maybe managing and documentation the care of a patient, and to be a little bit far away from the directly care of the immediate patient. So for an increasing number of the use cases, and especially those that I described at the beginning, the red ecosystem is where we need the data from. Also, like laboratory data that needs to get back into the green circle so that we can make use of it. Of course, also something like patient demographics. On the green side, so we need some kind of a way to exchange the data between these two circles from my perspective. And I think the good news is that there has been already a lot of work on how to build a bridge between the green circle and the red circle, between SDC and, for example, HS7 Fire. It's ongoing work, but because they have been developed in parallel, there are much commonalities and you can easily transform the data between these two. So from to sum it up, from a devices perspective, the standard landscapes focuses maybe for directly patient-related care applications on IEEE 11073 SDC on the one side, and HS7, hopefully in the future, mostly HS7 Fire on the other side. And this is really connected, or that you can connect via a two-way interoperability bridge that translates from SDC to Fire. Now that we have seen the standards landscapes from my perspective, coming from the medical device world, I would like to focus on the green ecosystem. So the 11073 SDC standards has been developed, and there are some main system functions that you can implement with the standards family. The standard itself was published and balloted by IEEE 11073 Point of Care Device Working Group, and the main authors came from organizations that are now part of a German non-profit organization association called or.net. If you want to have more information on that, it's or.net. You can find it on the website. The association has the objective to foster the interoperability within the hospital and has its roots in a number of research projects, I think starting in 2004, 2005. Now that we have developed the standard, the main system functions that you can realize with the SDC standards family are data visualization, of course, and here it makes heavily, or you can use the self-describing capabilities of the protocol, safe remote control of medical devices from other medical devices, also, of course, software as in medical devices, care automation use cases like safety interlocks and maybe physiological closed loop controllers, and of course, alert distribution from the bedside to where the clinician is actually. And this includes also something that we call in the SDC world alert signal delegation, where the device at the bedside stays silent and the alarm is only sounded there, for example, where it's really needed. The last point here is that you can, of course, make use of the data available for analytics, research, and so forth. For that purpose, you would typically then use the bridge that I just described before, and probably the analysis, it's way better done in something, in a system that maybe has a FHIR interface. So before we describe how our device A can be integrated in an SDC-based interoperable medical device system, I would like to know actually from you what you think today is the most important system function that can be realized. So, and I think Klaas already showed the poll for that. Thank you very much. I think we have a clear winner regarding the data analytics part of it, but there's also a pretty broad share regarding all the other features. I think it's quite a good mix. So how would we integrate now our device A into interoperable medical device system using SDC? Well, it would basically look like this. If our device A would implement an SDC interface, and I assume that the devices are either implemented SDC directly or maybe have a converter box at the beginning to integrate systems that are already on the market. And we would just implement that interface, the one standardized interface. And this would allow us to discover which devices are actually connected to our patient for device A, which measurements they can provide, and which control capabilities they offer. And of course, this interface could also be used to control these devices according to the policies that the devices provide from a risk management perspective. Maybe one additional benefit is that it would not only work in this specific setup, but if you add a new device, or if you, for example, attach our device A to a different setup where maybe a different patient monitor is used, the dynamic device capabilities, discovery functionality would allow that we determine it's a patient monitor, check which data it has, and could use it for display purposes. So what I would like to show you now is what is actually SDC. And I use the acronym now a lot, and maybe some of you already know it, but I have a question for you. Do you know what the SDC acronym actually stands for? Well, I think if I look at the results, we have a lot of people already that at least heard what the acronym stands for. So what I would like to show you now is what is actually SDC. So for those of you that have seen the results of the poll, SDC actually stands for Service-Oriented Device Connectivity. And there's a long and quite funny story behind it, how it came to that acronym. But in order to get to know that story, I would ask you, please join the IEEE working group. This is where these funny acronyms come from. So standardization often sounds pretty boring, but actually we have a lot of fun there. So normally when I use this slide, I say this is the most technical slide of the presentation. Why is this? It basically shows you how the protocol stack in SDC work, and it uses a figure or a graphic from one of my colleagues from the OR.NET consortium, Martin Kasparek, and it depicts that both ends, in this case our device A and the ventilator, have to implement the SDC protocol stack, which sits on top of TCP/IP and UDP. I will go a little bit more into the protocol stack later, but you could basically, or what you should remember is that the SDC standards family consists of core standards. One is related to something called the Web Service Transport, MDPWS. There is something that's called the Domain and Information and Service Model. We call it BICEPS. And there's something that's called the glue specification that binds together the domain information model as well as the transport protocol, and takes also care of time synchronization and quality of service. So these are the 3 SDC core standards, which allow already more or less all the capabilities that I described beforehand. I would like to show you now one feature of SDC and how it works specifically related to dynamic capability discovery. This is what I mentioned before in the plug and play section. So let us assume that our device A has been started and is eager to display data from the medical devices at the point of care inside maybe of the isolation room. So what you can picture is as if device A is actually asking into the network who's out there. And the devices that we currently have connected to the network, a ventilator, infusion pumps, and the patient monitor will really reply with something like, I'm out there, and this is the address where you can contact me. Typically, they will, of course, provide way more information. So, for example, which location they are currently located so that we actually can choose the right devices if there are multiple on the network and only use those devices for the patient that we are actually interested in. So once our device A has found these devices, infusion pump, ventilator, or patient monitor, it maybe now wants to know more about the ventilator. So what kind of capabilities does this specific ventilator connected to the patient at the interesting location, so inside of the isolation room, actually provide? So it will ask the ventilator, which measurement do you provide, which settings do you have, and which settings are maybe controllable. So it will just ask the ventilator, what capabilities do you have? And you can really picture it is that the ventilator will reply more or less like with a digital machine-readable IFU, which includes all this information as well as production-specific information, maybe like the serial number, manufacturer, UDI, and a lot of more information. If later, during the treatment of the patient, maybe the configuration changes and a new measurement module is attached, then this is an update to the IFU. It's basically sent out to the patient monitor again, and the device A can use this information. So where is this all specified? And now I go into the details of the standards family. It's another very nice picture of Martin Kasparek and Björn Andersen. I think they're the source of this. Beforehand, I talked basically about the SDC core standards, which are part of the IEEE 1173 standards family. but there are some more standards. The core standards itself reference the 11073 nomenclature standards, which, for example, defines the concept of what is actually a heart rate and which code do I need to use to communicate that this is a heart rate that I measured. On top of this, there is currently work undergoing to provide so-called device specializations, where manufacturers, in this case, for example, surgical device manufacturers, sit together and work more or less on a minimal content for this IFU capability description that we just saw in our example. And inside of this, it's also how the content should be structured and which terms from the nomenclature should be used. In the middle, the green part, are the key interoperability purposes. And there, the main objective is to profile the technical core specifications for the three key interoperability purposes: metric reporting, alerting, and control. And the main objective here is to clear the regulatory pathway for allowing the integration of individually released conformant products at the hospital into one interoperable medical device system. And for that, they not only consider additional technical requirements, but also process-related requirements, e.g. regarding risk management or, for example, usability. From my perspective, that is one of the real interesting topics for the future, or for the next months, and actually related to the regulatory strategy of product development. So, and this last point actually leads me to my last topic for today. And during that, I want to discuss with you how IEEE 11073 is actually integrated into the world of IHE that some of you might be familiar with. So what I will talk now about is IHE SD-PI. What this stands for, it's another interesting acronym, but it is basically SDC at IHE PCD, or devices as it's now called. So we learned already that there is the IEEE 11073 SDC Standards Family, and that it is complementing the interoperability landscape that already includes HH7 Fire, for example. So why do we need something else under the umbrella of IHE? Well, from my perspective, I think the IEEE specifications, they are very technical and addressing more the manufacturer side. In contrast to this, IHE typically addresses also healthcare organization and explains the use of the technology in clinical use cases, which makes also the documentation more readable for this audience. And of course, IHE also addresses a lot of healthcare IT companies that maybe are not the classical medical device vendors. Moreover, and that is one big aspect here as well, is that IHE provides also a nice conformance assessment scheme, which can be used to test conformance for interoperability standards. And this is what we would like to use to clear the regulatory pathway, as I just mentioned before, and to allow a vendor to demonstrate conformance by going through this conformity assessment based on the IHE technical framework SD-PI. So you can basically sum it up as IHE SD-PI paints basically the big picture for medical device interoperability from the medical device interface perspective, and it will be the foundation for conformance testing. And also it explains the use of the technology SDC in clinical use cases to other stakeholders. I would like now to come to my conclusion so that we have enough time for our discussion. And this will basically summarize the benefits of a standardized interface as I see it, especially with a focus on the use case of our device A that I used through the whole webinar. One big aspect here is, of course, from a device A's perspective, it has standardized access to the information, which definitely reduces the integration complexity for devices like device A, all these kind of clinical applications. It makes also use of the qualification of the data within the SDC network or in the protocol, where you can decide if this is medical grade data or if it's more data for documentation purposes only. This is coming from the source device, the information. What I didn't touch so far is the whole aspect of the transport layer security, but SDC also uses there the state-of-the-art technology. So from my perspective, the benefit for the patient is that he will get safe, secure, and effective care with innovative medical devices. From a staff, we address the customer need that they want to limit the staff exposure and still have effective patient care. And from a manufacturer's perspective, it is that you are now part of an extensible ecosystem and can really create and focus on value and don't have to implement all the different drivers for all the different libraries. I think that's a big benefit, especially if you want to be fast and deliver devices like our device A for isolation room monitoring, basically. So I have one last question for you, and this is related to the fact that if you or your organization provides already interoperable products, or if you want to use interoperable products within your hospital organization, for example. Thank you very much. So there seems to be already someone using SDC, and that brings me actually to my last slide. I want to give you an outlook. So what I stated before is the whole journey started in 2004. For me, it was actually 2006. And in 2015, we started the OR.NET Association that we are part of, created the first IEEE core standards, have now the IHE white paper out and working on the technical framework. But of course, this wouldn't be all worth anything if we wouldn't come from the proof of concept over the international standards towards products. And my short search, I just picked two examples that I don't want to get into it. There are already the first products out there that make use of the idea of SDC for point of care device interoperability. And I think that's a good sign. And I'm looking forward to see more of these kind of products inside of the market, so that maybe in 1 or 2 years, we could easily implement our example device A based on SDC. And this was basically my last slide, and I would like to thank you for your attention. And maybe Klaas has collected some questions so that we can now use the time to answer these questions. One last reminder, at the end of this webinar, there will be a very short survey. It's less than a minute, and we would be happy if you fill it out. So I see Klaas has found a lot of questions. And what I will do now is actually I will start from top to bottom and try to answer these questions. So one question is what about interoperability on the level of organizational leads? Syntax and semantics is easy to solve, but workflow and business models also need interoperability. Any suggestion on this issue? Maybe a sample for this question, transferring medication data from ICU system to ward system, combining with electronic patient data, discharge medication, received, and many more. A lot of workflow, a lot of different business models, and no interoperability on that level yet available. Well, I think that is a very valid question. And what I currently just touched on was more or less like the technical aspect that you have the foundational to work on this. But of course, all the technology doesn't bring anything if we do not address the organizational needs. From our history, or the history of Unity. We do also like a lot of consulting in the hospital work on processes, and I can definitely say that this is still an issue and it needs to be worked on in parallel. Otherwise, we probably don't need so much of the technology if we don't solve it at all. I hope this answers the question. If not, please contact me after the webinar and I would be happy to discuss this in more detail. There's a second question, if I read it correctly here, is about what about a software as a medical device, as a participant in an SDC network? Why we can't just use FHIR for everything? Well, of course, you can solve a lot of problems with FHIR. One differentiator that I tried to point it out was that there's a difference between more or less like the real-time acute care, where you really use the live data, and the things where it's a little bit more retrospectively, like maybe minutes old data that you want to use. This is of course okay if you are remote from the patient and cannot act directly on it. For that purposes, you could create a FHIR application that displays the data, because there you don't have not the time need for it. But if it goes to control, for that, there is currently no solution baked into FHIR because it's designed for the enterprise on how to do the control aspect. So that's why I typically differentiate. If you want to act directly on live patient data, make a decision, maybe at the bedside or directly on the ward so that you can act on it, I would always implement it with SDC. If it's not so time critical and maybe you don't want to do remote control of, let's say, a ventilator or something like that, then FHIR would be the right choice. And that's why I also wanted to point out that these are really two complementing standards that you can use to implement innovative use cases based on standardized interfaces. There's another question related to this topic that goes into the direction, would device A always need to be a medical device, or could it also be a software application such as an EMR or data analytics program? I think from the intended use case that I described, I'm of course not the regulatory affairs guys, but from what I know about this topic, device A would need to be a medical device as it's directly involved into the patient care, has live data, displays alarms for a medical purpose. So it qualifies as a medical device. And I would assume that in Europe, it would probably be a 2B device. So because it's still quite risky, maybe even 3, depending on which kind of device you control on the other side. We have some more questions, and I will read them out. So there's one question related that I pointed out during my presentation, the situation without SDC and with SDC. But I didn't address the time in between. So the question is, what's the next step? Because no company has already implemented SDC protocols inside of their devices, and what will happen in the next months or years? So from my perspective, there are already companies out there that are actively engaged, for example, in OR.net. So I do expect within this year and maybe next year coming out more companies working on this. And I participated myself in, I think now 3 SDC kind of connectathons where there was a lot of participation. I think we are on a good track. We will probably not see hundreds of medical devices implementing SDC directly this year, but I think it will come in the next 1 or 2 years. There's also the problem, of course, that they need implementation support. And if you have any questions regarding this and maybe want to do a prototype or whatsoever, you can always contact my colleagues from OR.net or me myself, and we can definitely help you there. So there's another question if there are any plans to transfer SDC from the medical device industry to the IVD industry. So in vitro diagnostics, there are currently no plans, but I think there also don't have to be any plans for that purpose. The protocol itself is basically around exchanging data, and you can model more or less everything because it uses the classic 11073 approach on how to model medical devices. And with that, I didn't find any device that I couldn't model yet. Of course, it shouldn't overlap with already existing standards like DICOM, so you wouldn't probably do the image transfer based on SDC, but if it's about the controlling, maybe the measurements, that could definitely be implemented also in vitro diagnostic devices based on SDC. If there's more interested and we want to go into the details, as mentioned before, you can contact me or one of my colleagues from the OR.NET Association. There's another question that says, I mentioned IHE SD-Pi, and it's meant to have a plug and trust aspect in it. Does that mean that the IHE also has medical grade data functionality, so quality remains the same when going from the patient care network over to the enterprise world? I don't think so that we address this aspect. So what will be addressed inside of IHE SD-Pi is basically how or which tests or conformance check you have to perform in order to declare yourself conformant to the SDC specification and be ready to be easily integrated from a regulatory perspective into an interoperable medical device system. So what we don't address here, but it's maybe a good thing to think about, is how is the quality of the data when it goes over this bridge from the green circle that I showed to the red line. Currently, I think there's no quality statement within the protocol, FHIR or H7 version 2, that indicates, for example, this data is for information documentation purposes, and this data has been qualified by the manufacturer. Here, really, currently the hospital and maybe the vendors have to take care manually to see, okay, these intended uses really fit together, and I can use that data source on the red circle on the enterprise for clinical applications. But it's maybe worth a point, and maybe Todd and I and the others on the IHE SD-Pi working group should spend a paragraph on this topic, how the data quality maybe ends or is moved over the bridge from SDC to the HS7 FHIR world. There's one additional question regarding video and light capabilities. So are video and light capabilities, control and streaming, addressed in the mod specs? Currently, the person only sees endoscopic stuff regarding this topic so far. Streaming capabilities would also be interesting. As far as I know, and I'm actually not the expert on that topic, I just help with modeling it in SDC. The expert for this would be my colleague from OR.NET, Martin Kasparek, and maybe Björn Andersen, as being part of the POC-spec project. You basically describe in SDC the capabilities of, for example, the light source or the video equipment, and the data stream, the image stream, is then streamed using other ways for video streaming. So you could maybe control in the future these kind of devices. I think that will be also specified, but it's not the data stream, not the video stream itself that you would transmit via SDC. There are already existing standards, and we shouldn't invent this again. There is one question going more into the direction of additional data. So there's the question on how biceps is the domain information and service model. So one of the 3 SDC core specifications. How does it handle additional data such as medication lists or problem lists or lab results? For that aspect, during the research projects that in the end led up to the ORNet consortium, we also had this question, and it was a big topic from one of our partners from the consortium at that point in time. So we included something into the domain information model, which is called a workflow context, where basically information from lab systems as well as informations like patient conditions, problem list, and so forth can be transmitted using the SDC protocol. For reference purposes, it, for example, also includes, if this is a DICOM source, it includes the information so that you can connect, for example, directly to the DICOM source as well, using that information, if not all the information is transmitted. We have another question inside of the chat that is related to if there is a standard on the gateway on how to convert between SDC and FHIR. Currently, I have to say there isn't anything, but there is a draft for that. And we are currently actively working in the HS7 working group on the implementation guide with colleagues from Philips, Draeger, from the ORNet consortium, and we do a mapping on how the SDC data can be easily mapped to the FHIR resources, so that later if someone wants to implement this, they don't have to figure it out by themselves, and maybe the mapping to FHIR wouldn't be interoperable anymore, but this is why we work on this implementation guide. There's one question, and that is related to the liability perspective, so probably everything regarding when I put a product onto the market. How realistic is it that a third-party software controls a life-supporting device, such as a ventilator? Well, from my perspective and from the discussions that I had over the last 2 years with regulatory authorities in Europe and in the US, I think it's very realistic. We probably cannot do it completely, I would say generically, but we can make it based on maybe device classes. This will be, for example, inside of these core key interoperability purposes. There's everything related to risk management in there, and also this question is addressed. How do you test if you don't have the third-party device there, and maybe it's from a different manufacturer? And what are the responsibilities of the different manufacturers in this aspect? We have discussed it with, as I mentioned, different regulatory authorities, and I'm pretty positive that we will see devices and products like our device A in the market that would actually control, for example, a ventilator that's not coming from the same company. Yeah. So we have one last question here in my list. This is related to SDC over wireless connection. And it's, is SDC over wireless also only addressed with respect to interoperability? So it's probably asking, can you use SDC also over a wireless connection? And here the answer is definitely yes, if the connection is an IP-based network. That is basically the common or the thing that at least needs to be integrated. One other aspect of it is that the wireless infrastructure, of course, would need to be able to use multicast. This is for the discovery aspect. If we don't use one other option. But yes, it can be used over a wireless IP connection. And I think that's also what we see or will see in the future, that, for example, patient monitors or infusion pumps, as they are already wireless, if they will implement SDC, they will definitely do it also via the wireless interface. And I think from my perspective, that's especially also relevant in markets where you maybe don't want to put cables into the wall nowadays. The aspects of safety, security, and effectiveness here is that inside of the protocols, and especially also inside of the key interoperability purposes, there are advices and things that you need to consider from a risk management perspective. And of course, having a wireless infrastructure, which maybe is not so reliable as if you would use a cable, maybe you have to consider different things, but it will be possible to implement, for example, also our device A scenario based on a wireless connection. So that were all the questions that we had from the audience, and I would really like to thank you also for your participation here. And I would like to hand back to Moritz for some final words.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your presentation. Thank you very much for your participation in all the questions you have sent us. Maybe one important information to you. So after this webinar, we are going to consolidate all the questions or the answers, plus the pulse you gave us, and consolidate everything and send this to you by next week. So that means all the shown slides you're going to receive by next week, plus a link to the recorded webinar, so that you're able to maybe go back to some information. Last but not least, I can highly recommend you to look at our homepage. There we do have a couple of user stories, and I told you at the beginning that within the next couple of weeks and months, we are going through this big picture and setting up similar seminars or webinars to explain you how we see like the opportunities and chances to improve when it comes to digitalization of the medical device industry. Thank you very much for participating, and we wish you a good time. Stay safe.
Thank you also from my side, and I think we will now close the webinar. Thank you and see you soon.